Phil McMichael, who's a professor of development sociology at Cornell. And he also has a number of books, Settlers and the Agrarian Question, Development and Social Change, A Global Perspective, Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions, and he's edited a number of books, including Biofuels, Land, and Agrarian Change with June Boras and Ian Schoons. He does food regime analysis, as many of you know, and he examines the agrarian question historically.
Good morning, all. IBM runs an advertisement on television that intones, "Let's build a smarter planet." While this refrain normalizes technological fixes, it also assumes either that humans are the chosen species or that the planet is somehow undeveloped, or indeed ill-equipped to manage the future, a future that we now call the Anthropocene age. Mastering nature, undoing biodiversity, and displacing other species has been the goal of what Daniel Quinn calls the takers, ever since the early domestication of agriculture. In contrast, the makers, those who practice biocentrism, have understood implicitly the taker's folly. I like to think of the food sovereignty movement as approximating the sensibility of the makers. While a part of this movement includes indigenous peoples who may embody the maker role, much of the food sovereignty movement is concerned with reversing the taker syndrome, that is, promoting food justice, repeasantizing by co-producing with nature, and as the Canadians put it so nicely, resetting the table. This is not a unified movement, as many papers have emphasized, but the movement embodies a unifying sensibility, insofar as its many strands struggle to replace taking by making, for example, restoring carbon cycles with agroecology, building nested local markets, or finding ways to restore food systems to a human democratic scale that is ecosystemic. As Via Campesina puts it, reproducing a model of life. In this sense, as Mark Edelman suggests, peasantness is a political rather than an analytical category, and as I argue, it performs the warning function of the proverbial canary in the mine. There are many, many strands to this process, and there are tensions and or contradictions so thoughtfully addressed by many of the papers. How to get from A to B is the question they're ultimately asking, the answer to which is bubbling up across a multitude of local experiments as depicted in, for example, Raj Patel's Generation Food Project website. Remodeling life, that is reversing the ontology of taking, is not a simple project, but it is a matter of survival. Robert Watson, the ISTAD director, remarked, quote, that business as usual would mean more environmental degradation and the Earth's haves and have-nots splitting further apart. It would leave us facing a world nobody would want to inhabit. It is this future that the food sovereignty movement confronts at the same time as much of the rest of the world is engaged in building a smarter planet. While food sovereignty initially politicized neoliberal claims of food security via a food export regime, the ensuing food crisis has triggered a restructuring of that regime. A governing world price at its lowest in 150 years in 1999, and therefore at its deadliest for smallholders forced to compete against subsidized corporate agro-exports, has given way now to price volatility, agflation, and managed trade associated with the land grabbing. In 2000, Via Campesina observed that the massive movement of food around the world is forcing the increased movement of people. But now it is the case that the massive movement of money around the world will accelerate the increased movement of people off the land. It's the difference between the dumping of surplus food bombs, that is the cheap food regime, and enclosure via financial cluster bombs, the latter being deployed indiscriminately on landscapes renamed financial assets to produce fungible or flex crops or simply inflate value. Governance mechanisms like the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition enable this process with non-trade partnerships underwritten by land retitling in a counter-mobilization against UN-based right-to-food initiatives. This marks a new convergence of financial and territorial forms of power, historically distinct cycles across hegemonic eras, as Giovanni Arrighi explained, but now increasingly integrated with devastating effect on inhabitants and habitats. One might paraphrase Olivier de Schutter by observing that the new land governance mechanisms seek to responsibly execute the terms of the classical agrarian question. Under these conditions, Peter Rosset and Maria Elena Martinez Torres, for example, observed the Brazilian MST has less idle land to occupy simply for social purposes, as that land is being enclosed as a financial asset. And so the MST is compelled, fortuitously or not, to update its claims for agrarian citizenship by sponsoring agroecological practices and craft a thoroughly modern vision of biodiversity preservation. If food sovereignty is understood as the historic counter-movement and counterpart to the food regime, it's important to trace this changing landscape of exploitation and possibility. I focus on the process of emptying the countryside, arguably at a tipping point, with the possible expulsion of approximately 1.5 billion landed people by mid-century, with all the loss that entails. It's a process, as Jennifer Clapp notes, scarcely visible to the urban consumer who may assume agribusiness feeds the world. And it's a process justified by a developmentalist view of the countryside as comprising unlimited supplies of labour. As land grab governances materialise, agrarian counter-movements and their allies are mobilising in national spaces and international forums like the CFS, the FAO, and adopting human rights approaches to challenge market or investor rights in defence of territory and land access, outlined in the recent Land Sovereignty Manifesto by June Boris and Jenny Franco. I would argue this moment is overdetermined by a combination of the land grab and financialisation. The latter, having reduced food to a fungible relation, is premised on unlocking value in empty calories, marginalising those who know how to work the land, and hastening the exhaustion of natural processes by converting them to speculative resources, that is, new fictitious commodities, rendering them vulnerable to enclosure and exhaustion. This can only exert upward pressure on food prices and reactivate food riots and accumulating recognition of the urban dimensions of the 21st century agrarian question. That is, that wealth ultimately flows from the land and that there is a strategic and civilizational significance of the land, of farming the land responsibly for people rather than for profit. Thank you.
Thank you.